The morning light spilled across the open floor as I sifted through unread emails, the routine rhythm of a day that had not yet revealed its shape. My fingers hovered over the keyboard when a shadow fell across my desk. "Inez?" The voice was sharp, carrying the weight of a command rather than a call. I looked up to find Daniel Cross, the newly appointed CEO, standing at the threshold of the floor. He didn't need to repeat himself. Dozens of eyes had already turned, silence spreading in ripples as conversations died mid-sentence. I closed my laptop slowly and stood. His smile was that of a predator who believed the outcome already settled. My heels echoed against the polished floor as I followed him through the maze of desks toward the glass-walled conference room. Inside, he positioned himself at the head of the table, hands braced like a general about to issue orders. He didn't offer me a seat. "Let's not waste each other's time," he began, his voice pitched just high enough for anyone passing outside to hear. "Your role here is redundant. You're dead weight on payroll." The words landed deliberately, like stones meant to bruise. I saw the silhouettes of coworkers pause at the glass walls, their outlines frozen in a voyeur's silence. Daniel pressed on. "Pack up your desk. Security will escort you out within the hour." He was savoring this, waiting for the performance of outrage or pleading. Instead, I gave him none of it. My face remained still, my pulse steady. "Understood," I said simply. His expression faltered, if only for a second. He recovered with a curt nod, but I had seen the surprise flicker across his eyes. The truth was, I had already known. That morning, an anonymous message had landed in my inbox. "He plans to make you an example today." Whoever sent it had given me the courtesy of preparation. I had walked into this ambush already armored. I stepped back from the table, calm and unshaken. Security would come soon. I had no reason to resist. As I turned toward the door, a faint smile tugged at my lips, a smile that Daniel did not understand yet. And with that quiet trace of satisfaction, I walked back toward my desk, ready for what came next. 2 days before Daniel staged his little performance, I sat across from Mariana Estevez in her oak-paneled office, the smell of polished wood and faint lemon oil hanging in the air. She slid a folder across the desk, its weight far heavier than the paper inside. "All signatures are in place," she said, tapping the final page with her pen. "As of today, you control 62% of the company's voting shares." The words seemed to echo in the stillness of the room. For a moment, I only stared at the ink of my name on the page, my hand still tingling from the stroke of the pen. I had always thought of myself as a custodian, not an owner, but my late uncle's foresight had rewritten that role. "It's airtight?" I asked, hearing my own voice quieter than usual. Mariana nodded once. "Structured through the trust exactly as your uncle intended. The board won't be aware until you choose to make it public. Until then, you hold the power quietly." Quiet power. The phrase stayed with me. I remembered my father's weathered hands cutting a red ribbon outside the company's first warehouse decades ago, his voice ringing with pride as he told the gathered crowd that a business was only as strong as the people who carried it forward. I had been a teenager then, standing at his side, not understanding the weight of those words. Now, as I sat in Mariana's office, the past folded neatly into the present. My father had built the foundation, my uncle had safeguarded it, and I had just accepted its mantle. Mariana closed the folder and slid it into a leather case. "Congratulations, Inez. You hold more control than anyone in that building, even the incoming CEO. Don't waste it." I rose from my chair, steadied by her certainty. Outside the window, the city stretched endlessly, a mosaic of glass and steel. I understood then that patience was not weakness, it was strategy. 2 days later, when Daniel tried to strip me of dignity, I already held the one weapon he could never see coming, and that knowledge steadied me as I prepared to walk out under his escort. The silence of the office pressed against me as I returned to my desk. The walk back longer than I remembered. Conversations had dimmed to whispers, curiosity barely hidden behind half-raised screens. I lowered myself into my chair and opened the top drawer, pulling out a small cardboard box. I didn't bother with files or papers. Those belonged to the company, not to me. Instead, I chose only the things that carried weight beyond their function. The ceramic mug Emma from accounting had given me last Christmas, painted with clumsy snowflakes by her daughter, the tiny cactus that had somehow survived despite my neglect, its stubborn resilience almost a joke between us, and the framed photo of my father, sun in his eyes, scissors in his hand, cutting the ribbon to open the company's first warehouse. Each item slipped into the box like a piece of armor, reminders that I wasn't leaving empty-handed. My father's smile in that photograph steadied me more than any words could have. A cough broke the quiet. 2 men from security stood nearby, their posture awkward, eyes apologetic. I offered them a nod, lifting the box carefully. I'm ready. The walk to the elevators felt like a parade in reverse, co-workers ducking their gazes, others staring openly as though memorizing my downfall. Yet my steps were measured, not heavy. At the glass doors, I caught my reflection, calm, composed. At the corner of my mouth, the faintest curl of a smile, not spiteful, not defiant, simply knowing. Daniel believed he had erased me. What he couldn't see was the folder waiting at home, locked in its leather case, proof that he had fired not an employee, but the majority shareholder of the very company he sought to control. The elevator doors closed, and with them, the chapter of my employment ended. But in just 1 week, a new meeting would begin, and I would return not to plead for my place, but to claim what was already mine. The following afternoon, I met Andres Vega at a small cafe off Union Square, a place noisy enough to mask conversations, yet quiet in the corners where we sat. His expression carried the same mix of concern and loyalty I remembered from our early days running operations together. He's not showing the real numbers, Andres said after the first sip of his coffee. Turnover is worse than it looks on the reports. Deadlines are sliding, and costs are climbing. He's dressing it up for the board. I leaned forward, lowering my voice. Can you get me the unfiltered data? He didn't hesitate. Give me 3 days. I'll make sure it's clean and verifiable. If anyone questions it, they won't be able to deny what's on the servers. I reached across the table and squeezed his hand once in gratitude. He understood without more words. That evening, I met Carmen Larios in a dim wine bar tucked between old brownstones. She had resigned 6 months earlier, and whispers had followed her exit. Now, with the soft clink of glasses in the background, she told me why. 2 harassment complaints, she said, sliding a slim folder across the table. Daniel signed off on closing them without review. When I pushed back, they pushed me out. Inside the folder were copies of documents, signatures neat and undeniable. I looked up at her. You kept these for protection, she replied. But if you're serious about taking him down, you'll need them. I slipped the folder into my bag, the weight of it pressing against the leather as if to remind me of the stakes. Between Andres's data and Carmen's testimony, the picture was sharpening into something damning. But Carmen wasn't finished. She leaned in, her voice dropping lower. One more thing. He's been meeting with executives from Grayson Consolidated. Word is, he's arranging to sell the company cheap, and the payoff doesn't go to shareholders. It goes to him The chill that passed through me wasn't fear, it was clarity. The clock had started ticking. Daniel wasn't just reckless, he was preparing to gut the house my family had built. I had to move before he did. By midweek, I knew I needed more than numbers and complaints. I needed someone who understood the machinery of boards and the language that frightened them into compliance. That was how Patricia Rowan entered my life again. Patricia had the kind of reputation that made directors nervous. She'd built a career dismantling governance failures, exposing fiduciary negligence with surgical precision. When she arrived at my apartment, her leather briefcase hit the coffee table with a thud heavy enough to quiet the room. I laid out what I had collected Andres' figures, Carmen's complaints, whispers of Daniel's backroom deal. She leafed through it page by page, her eyes narrowing in places, lips pressing into a thin line. "You have more than smoke," she said finally. "This is fire, negligence, suppression of employee rights, financial misrepresentation if the board ignores this. They expose themselves legally." That's leverage. Her certainty steadied me, but she wasn't finished. "Don't underestimate them. The board's instinct will be self-preservation. They'll close ranks, maybe even circle around Daniel if they think it keeps scrutiny away from themselves. If you move, you must move decisively. No second chances." I felt the weight of her warning, but hesitation was no longer in me. The trust my uncle had left was not a gift to hoard. It was a responsibility to wield. That night, Mariana and I sat side by side in her office as she typed the notice. The words were stark and irrefutable. "As majority shareholder, I hereby call a special meeting of the board to review the position of Chief Executive Officer and the current executive leadership." When the message was sent, silence lasted less than an hour. My phone lit up with numbers I recognized: board members, assistants, even old colleagues, all demanding explanations. I answered none of them. Their anxiety was part of the plan. Patricia's voice echoed in my mind as I closed the phone face down. The board would fight to save themselves, and I would let the fear ferment until the only safe choice left was mine. The notice had barely been out for 48 hours when I received the message. A simple line on my phone dinner. 8 o'clock. No staff. They. I knew who it was before I read the initials. Victor Albright, one of the senior board members. A man whose wealth came less from building and more from attaching himself to other people's foundations. I agreed, though my gut told me the invitation wasn't about food. We met at a private dining room in a midtown steakhouse, the kind of place where cigars and secrets lingered longer than the meals. Victor poured himself a glass of red and looked at me as though I were a junior associate who needed reminding of her place. "You've stirred waters better left calm, Inez," he said smoothly. "Withdraw the notice. Save yourself some trouble." I folded my hands on the table. Trouble for me. Or for you. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "There are matters regarding your uncle's trust. Technicalities. Things that could raise questions if anyone chose to examine them. You wouldn't want to tarnish his memory or your own position over a power play." The threat was veiled, but only just. I let a moment of silence stretch before answering, my voice cold. "My family built this company. Yours only fed off it. If you think I'll abandon what they created, you've mistaken me for someone who can be bought." Victor's jaw tightened. He swirled the wine, but his composure had cracked. When he finally leaned back, I knew he had no more leverage than whispers. The dinner ended without dessert. I walked out into the chill night air, more certain than ever Daniel and his allies would not surrender easily. They would smear, threaten, and claw to hold on to power. The next morning, I added to my dossier testimonies from long-time employees, quiet voices who had seen corners cut and rules bent. Their stories carried weight, human truth to match the paper evidence. By the time I closed the folder, it was thicker, sharper, ready for the moment I would place it before the board. Thursday arrived sharp and cold, the kind of morning that demanded clarity. I dressed deliberately, a navy suit, cut clean. No jewelry except the watch my father once wore when he opened the first warehouse. I wanted no embellishment, only the presence of someone who belonged at the head of the table. The elevator ride to the top floor was silent, but heavy with anticipation. When the doors slid open, I stepped into the boardroom without pause. Conversations died instantly. Every leather chair was filled, eyes narrowing as I walked to the head seat and pulled it back without asking permission. The scrape of the chair against the floor felt louder than it should have, a declaration before I spoke a word. "This meeting," I said, unfolding my folder and laying it flat before me, "is convened under my authority as majority shareholder. We are here to review the leadership of this company." The sentence fell into the room like a stone dropped in water. Mr. Redmond cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. Others exchanged wary glances. At the far end, Daniel leaned back, his smirk sharp as a blade. "You've been gone a week," he sneered. "And you imagine yourself a queen because you've stolen a few papers. Sit down before you embarrass yourself." I ignored him, sliding the first stack of documents across the polished oak. Quarterly numbers. Actual revenue versus reported revenue. 47% variance, taken directly from internal servers. A murmur ran along the table. One director frowned as she skimmed the sheets, then looked sharply at Daniel. He waved it off with a laugh, but it rang hollow. The second stack followed employee complaints, closed without investigation, several with his signature. Then came the emails, a trail of conversations with Grayson Consolidated, clear as ink, revealing his intent to sell the company beneath market value. Daniel's smile faltered when I finally leaned forward. "I hold 62% of the vote," I said evenly. "Your approval is no longer optional." The silence that followed wasn't indecision. It was the sound of men and women calculating whether they would sink with him or survive with me. I let the silence stretch long enough for every eye in the room to settle on me. Then I lifted the final sheet of paper and placed it in the center of the table. I moved for the immediate removal of Daniel Cross as Chief Executive Officer. I said, my tone measured. As majority shareholder, I cast my 62% of the vote in favor. The words landed with the weight of inevitability. Chairs creaked as members shifted, some in relief, others in resignation. No one spoke in Daniel's defense. For a heartbeat, he sat frozen, the smugness gone from his face, replaced by disbelief. Then he shot to his feet, his chair skidding against the floor with a harsh scrape. "This is a farce," he shouted, his voice ricocheting off the walls. "You think this company can last a month without me? It will collapse within weeks. You'll be begging me to come back." I met his glare with steady calm. "It already was collapsing under you." The words cut sharper than any raised voice. The board members didn't look at him now. They looked at the evidence spread before them, at the signatures, at the numbers. He had nothing left but anger. The secretary of the board cleared her throat, her voice thin but decisive. "By the authority vested in this body, the motion carries, effective immediately." Daniel gathered his papers in frantic, jerky movements, avoiding my gaze. When security stepped inside, his outrage turned to muttered curses. But he didn't resist. They flanked him just as they had once flanked me. Only this time, the spectacle was his. The door closed behind him with a click that seemed to echo through the room. The weight lifted, but not completely. His exit was only the end of one battle, not the war. I sat back, my father's watch cool against my wrist, and allowed myself one quiet breath. Daniel Cross was gone, but the company he had left behind was fractured, wounded, and mine to heal. The morning after Daniel's removal, the board gathered again, this time subdued and cautious. I nominated Ricardo Noland, the head of engineering, as interim CEO. Ricardo had always been a quiet man, more comfortable on the floor with his teams than in corner offices. When I asked him privately if he would step up, he agreed with one condition. We do this the right way, or not at all. His condition became my compass. Within a week, we began undoing the cuts that had gutted morale. Customer service rehired its best representatives. The development team regained resources that had been stripped to the bone, and the budget for training returned. Carmen came back, this time as an external advisor, with a mandate to rebuild HR on foundations of transparency and trust. Together, we launched an independent ethics hotline, managed outside the company to prevent interference. The effects spread quickly. Hallways once tense with silence now carried the sound of laughter. Conversations no longer died when managers walked by. Resignation letters stopped landing on desks. Clients who had grown wary began calling again, their voices steadier, their contracts renewed. But Daniel, even outside the building, tried to claw his way back. Articles began appearing in trade outlets, hinting that my takeover was illegitimate, that I had manipulated a trust to seize control. I did not answer with anger. Instead, I gave reporters copies of the very documents Daniel had mocked in the boardroom share certificates, signed transfers, legal filings, all verified by Mariana and Patricia. The story flipped overnight. Headlines that once questioned me now demanded to know how Daniel had hidden his misconduct for so long. His weapon had become his undoing. The last shard of credibility shattered in public view. The company was no longer his shadow to cast, it was ours to rebuild. As I walked through the office one late evening, the light spilling across rows of desks, I realized the place no longer felt broken. It was still fragile, still scarred, but it was alive again and ready for what came next. 6 months later, the numbers told a story no headline could twist. Voluntary turnover had dropped to its lowest in a decade. Customer satisfaction surveys returned with scores that outpaced our competitors. Revenue wasn't explosive, but it was steady, reliable, and rooted in work we could defend with pride. The company felt less like a battlefield and more like the house my father had once envisioned, sturdy, human, alive. The transformation became most visible the day we gathered in the main hall, the same space where decades earlier my father had stood with scissors in his hand and hope in his eyes. Rows of employees filled the seats, faces expectant, cautious, yet carrying a spark I hadn't seen in years. I stepped up to the podium, the weight of their silence pressing on me until I spoke. Some of you remember when this hall echoed with promises. I began. Others only know it as a place where orders were barked and people reduced to numbers. 6 months ago, I was told payroll was dead weight. Today, I stand here to tell you what payroll truly is. Names, lives, families. That is our strength, and it always will be. For a moment, the quiet lingered. Then applause rose, not wild, not forced, but deep and steady. It wasn't for me alone. It was for themselves, for the truth of being seen again. I watched people turn to each other, nodding, smiling, and in that collective motion, I felt the pulse of renewal. Later that evening, I sat in my office, the photo of my father hanging above the credenza. Papers spread across the desk showed modest but honest figures, growth without deception, progress without exploitation. I traced the outline of my father's smile in the picture and let the thought settle like a closing chapter. You called me dead weight. I whispered into the quiet. Today, I carried the weight that buried you. The office lights reflected softly against the window, and in that reflection, I no longer saw survival. I saw legacy rebuilt, restored, and finally my own to protect.